Rachel's testimony sent shockwaves through the community. It was one thing to suspect bias. It was another to hear it confirmed by someone on the inside. Protesters renewed their calls for Holloway's removal, while legal experts debated whether his comments constituted grounds for impeachment. The pressure mounted until it became impossible for the judicial board to ignore any longer. For Marcus, watching the tide turn was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication, knowing that others finally understood the pain he had endured. On the other hand, the constant scrutiny and reminders of that day in court weighed heavily on him. Painting remained his refuge, allowing him to process his emotions and find moments of peace amidst the chaos. His artwork continued to inspire others, with several pieces being featured in galleries and online exhibitions dedicated to raising awareness about systemic inequality. As the investigation into Judge Holloway gained steam, Angela reminded herself, and Marcus, that the fight was far from over. Change rarely came quickly or easily, but every step forward mattered. Together, they vowed to keep pushing, knowing that their efforts weren't just for themselves. They were for anyone who had ever walked into a courtroom and felt like their voice didn't count. The small courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the wooden benches creaked under the weight of those waiting for the proceedings to begin. At the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, a 14-year-old boy with wide, nervous eyes that darted around the room. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and he clutched the edges of his worn jacket like it was a shield protecting him from the piercing stares of the crowd. Marcus had been accused of stealing a bike, a shiny red one that belonged to a neighbor. He swore up and down that he hadn't done it, but no one seemed to believe him. Instead, here he was, standing in front of Judge Richard Holloway, a man whose reputation preceded him. People whispered about how harsh he could be, especially when dealing with kids who came from troubled backgrounds. And today, Marcus knew he fit that description perfectly. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on Marcus. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat loudly, silencing the murmurs in the room. For a moment, there was only the sound of shuffling papers and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, without warning, the judge began speaking, not to ask questions or seek clarification, but to mock. Well, Judge Holloway said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. A young man with, let's see, holes in his shoes, dirt on his face, and a story too tall to fit in this courtroom." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or stay silent. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he didn't dare look away. "And what do you call yourself?" The judge continued, raising an eyebrow. "A victim, or just another kid looking for trouble?" Each word hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He wanted to defend himself, to shout that he wasn't lying, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him speak. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked furiously to hold them back. This wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But nothing about this day had been fair so far. From the gallery, Marcus's mother, Angela, sat frozen in her seat. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She watched as her son, her bright, kind-hearted boy, was reduced to silence by the cruel words of a man who was supposed to uphold justice. Every fiber of her being screamed to stand up, to demand respect for her child, but she knew better. Speaking out now would only make things worse. Instead, she focused on Marcus, willing him to stay strong. She noticed the way his shoulders slumped, the way his usual confident posture had crumbled under the weight of the judge's ridicule. It broke her heart to see him like this. But even in her despair, something inside her stirred, a spark of determination. She wouldn't let this moment define Marcus. No matter what happened next, she vowed to fight for him, to show him that his voice mattered, even if the world tried to silence it. As the hearing dragged on, Judge Holloway barely glanced at the evidence, or lack thereof. that supported Marcus's innocence. Instead, he made snide comments about Marcus's clothes, his grades, and even his family. By the time the gavel finally came down, declaring Marcus guilty and placing him on probation, the entire room felt tainted. Justice hadn't been served. It had been twisted into something unrecognizable. But as Marcus walked out of the courthouse, his head bowed and his spirit bruised. He didn't know that this was only the beginning. What happened next would change everything. For him, for his family, and for the entire town. The momentum sparked by Sarah's article and Marcus's paintings reached a tipping point. What began as whispers of discontent grew into a roar that echoed far beyond the small town. People from all walks of life, parents, teachers, students, activists, and even former defendants, gathered outside the courthouse one chilly Saturday morning, holding signs that read "Enough is enough," and "Justice should be fair for all." The crowd swelled to hundreds, their voices rising in unison as they chanted slogans demanding accountability. At the heart of the protest stood Angela, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the sea of faces before her. For weeks, she had poured every ounce of energy into organizing this moment. Flyers had been distributed at schools, churches, and community centers. Social media posts had gone viral, and local radio stations had amplified the call to action. Now, seeing the turnout, she felt a surge of both pride and disbelief. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Nearby, Marcus stood quietly beside his mother, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the sheer size of the crowd made him uneasy. But as he scanned the faces around him, he noticed something remarkable. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds had come together, united by a shared purpose. Strangers approached him with kind smiles, thanking him for having the courage to speak out. Though it still felt surreal, Marcus couldn't deny the flicker of hope stirring within him. As the rally continued, speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Evelyn Carter stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom," she declared, gripping the mic stand. "It's about a system that allows cruelty and prejudice to thrive unchecked. We're here today not only to demand justice for Marcus, but to say loud and clear that no child or adult should ever be treated this way again." Her words ignited cheers from the crowd, followed by applause that rippled like waves. Next, Sarah Bennett spoke, sharing snippets of the stories she'd uncovered during her investigation. She recounted how Judge Holloway had dismissed evidence, mocked defendants, and handed down harsh sentences without remorse. "These aren't isolated incidents," she emphasized. "They're part of a pattern we can no longer ignore." The protests didn't stop there. Over the next few days, images and videos of the demonstration flooded social media, drawing national attention. News outlets picked up the story, airing segments featuring interviews with Angela, Marcus, and other victims of judicial bias. Celebrities and influencers joined the conversation, using their platforms to amplify the message. Even politicians weighed in, calling for an official inquiry into Judge Holloway's conduct. Inside the courthouse, however, tensions simmered. Judge Holloway remained defiant, dismissing the backlash as media sensationalism and accusing those speaking out of exaggerating his actions. In private conversations with colleagues, he claimed he was simply enforcing the law and maintaining order. Publicly, though, he avoided commenting further, aware that anything he said could be twisted against him. Meanwhile, the state judicial board came under increasing pressure to act. Letters poured in from concerned citizens, urging them to investigate Holloway's behavior. Lawyers who had once feared retaliation now submitted formal complaints, detailing instances where they believed the judge had acted unfairly. Even some of Holloway's own staff members began questioning whether they had turned a blind eye to his misconduct for too long. One pivotal moment came when a former clerk named Rachel Myers decided to break her silence. Rachel had worked closely with Holloway for years, witnessing firsthand his dismissive attitude toward marginalized defendants. Though she had initially feared losing her job, the growing movement emboldened her to step forward. In an exclusive interview with Sarah, Rachel revealed shocking details about Holloway's private remarks, including his admission that he believed certain groups were inherently more prone to criminal behavior. The state judicial board's formal hearing into Judge Richard Holloway's conduct was set to take place in a large, solemn courtroom that seemed too grand for the ugliness of the accusations being discussed. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks ready and cameras poised, while members of the public filled every available seat. Among them sat Angela, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Marcus, who appeared both nervous and resolute. It was a day they had been waiting for, a chance to confront the man who had mocked and humiliated so many. When Judge Holloway entered the room, flanked by his lawyers, the atmosphere shifted. He carried himself with the same air of authority he always did, but there was a tension in his jaw that betrayed his unease. As the proceedings began, witnesses were called one by one to testify about their experiences in his courtroom. James Carter recounted how Holloway had ridiculed him during sentencing, calling him a waste of space. Another defendant, a young woman named Lisa, described how the judge dismissed evidence supporting her innocence and mocked her for wearing second-hand clothes. Each story painted a clearer picture of a man who wielded power not to serve justice, but to demean those he deemed beneath him. But it was Marcus's testimony that struck the deepest chord. When his name was called, he rose slowly from his seat, his heart pounding as all eyes turned to him. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing at Angela, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and faced the panel of judges overseeing the hearing. "I didn't steal that bike," Marcus began, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. "But even if I had done something wrong, no one deserves to be treated the way Judge Holloway treated me. He made me feel like I wasn't human, like my life didn't matter." His words hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the faint sound of scribbling pens and the occasional rustle of papers. As Marcus spoke, Judge Holloway avoided eye contact, staring instead at the table in front of him. But when Rachel Myers, the former clerk, took the stand, the room fell utterly silent. Rachel recounted private conversations she'd overheard, including one where Holloway admitted to holding prejudiced views. He said things like, "People like them will never change," Rachel revealed, her voice steady despite the gravity of her statement. He didn't think anyone would care enough to challenge him. The impact of Rachel's testimony was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and several members of the judicial board exchanged concerned glances. Holloway's lawyer tried to discredit her, accusing her of exaggerating or fabricating details, but Rachel remained composed under questioning, sticking firmly to her account. By the end of the hearing, the evidence against Judge Holloway was overwhelming. Yet what truly shocked everyone came during closing arguments. One of the board members addressed Holloway directly, saying, "Your actions have undermined public trust in our system. If we are to uphold justice, we must hold ourselves accountable first." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, and for the first time, Holloway looked visibly shaken. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Angela and Marcus, eager for their reaction. Angela spoke first, her voice calm but unwavering. "This isn't just a victory for us. It's a reminder that justice can prevail when people come together to demand it." Then she turned to Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And this is proof that your voice matters." Marcus nodded, managing a small smile. Though the battle wasn't entirely over, he still bore scars from the ordeal. Something inside him felt lighter. Standing there, surrounded by supporters chanting his name, he realized that he had become part of something bigger than himself. This fight wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about creating a world where no child would ever feel powerless again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the courthouse steps, Marcus thought about the future. He imagined a courtroom where fairness reigned, where judges listened instead of judged harshly, and where art like his could inspire others to keep pushing for change. For now, though, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace, knowing that they had taken a crucial step toward justice, and that the journey ahead would be brighter because of it. The next morning, Sarah Bennett sat at her cluttered desk in a small corner of the bustling city newsroom. Her laptop screen glowed faintly as she scrolled through Angela's documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had spent years chasing stories about injustice, but something about Marcus's case felt different. It was personal, raw, and undeniably urgent. As she read through the transcripts and listened to Angela's recorded accounts, Sarah couldn't shake the image of a young boy standing powerless in front of a man who was supposed to protect him, but instead mocked him. Sarah knew she needed more than just Angela's testimony to make this story resonate with people. She began digging deeper into Judge Richard Holloway's career, combing through public records, court archives, and old newspaper articles. What she found chilled her. Over the past decade, several complaints have been filed against Holloway for biased rulings and disrespectful behavior toward defendants, particularly those from marginalized communities. Yet none of these complaints seemed to have led to any real consequences. It was as if the system itself shielded him, allowing his actions to go unchecked. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah reached out to some of the individuals mentioned in Angela's notes. One name stood out: James Carter, a former defendant who had been sentenced by Holloway 5 years ago. According to Angela, James had once spoken publicly about how the judge ridiculed him during sentencing. When Sarah called James, he sounded hesitant at first, but after hearing her genuine concern, he agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe downtown. James arrived wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a weathered backpack. His eyes were weary, but there was a flicker of determination in them when he spoke. "I don't talk about this much," he admitted, stirring sugar into his coffee. "But yeah, I remember what happened. The judge acted like I wasn't even human. Told me I'd end up back in jail before I finished my sentence." Sarah listened intently, jotting down notes as James recounted his experience. He described how Holloway dismissed evidence that supported his innocence and made sarcastic remarks about his background. "It wasn't just me," James added. "There were others too, kids mostly. Folks didn't say anything because they thought no one would listen." As Sarah continued her investigation, she realized she wasn't alone in wanting change. Local activists, including Evelyn Carter, rallied around Angela and Marcus, organizing meetings to strategize their next steps. At one such gathering held in a community center basement, Sarah watched as Angela stood nervously beside Evelyn, addressing a group of concerned citizens. "We can't let this go unnoticed," Angela said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Marcus is just one child among many who face this kind of treatment. If we stay silent, it will keep happening. We need to demand accountability, not just for us, but for future generations." Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. People nodded in agreement, sharing their own experiences or those of loved ones who had suffered under similar circumstances. For the first time, Angela saw the power of collective action. Strangers became allies, united by a shared goal: to expose Judge Holloway's misconduct and push for reform within the justice system. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly to piece together her article. She interviewed lawyers, social workers, and community leaders, weaving their perspectives into a narrative that highlighted not only Marcus's story, but also the systemic issues plaguing the courthouse. Every detail mattered. The tone of Holloway's voice, the dismissive glances, the subtle ways bias crept into decisions. Sarah wanted readers to feel the weight of what had happened, to understand why this moment mattered. One evening, as she typed the final lines of her draft, Sarah paused and leaned back in her chair. She thought about Marcus, sitting quietly in his home while his mother fought for justice on his behalf. She thought about Angela, whose courage inspired so many others to join the cause. And she thought about all the untold stories waiting to be heard, stories of resilience, hope, and the unyielding belief that fairness could still prevail. When Sarah submitted her article to her editor, she included a note: This isn't just a story. It's a call to action. Little did she know, those words would soon ripple far beyond the pages of a newspaper, igniting a movement that would leave an entire town, and perhaps the nation, questioning what true justice really meant. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Marcus and Angela, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like a storm cloud over them. As they stepped onto the cracked pavement outside, Angela could feel her son's pain radiating off him in waves. His face was pale, his eyes red from holding back tears, and his usual confident stride had been replaced by slow, heavy steps. He didn't say a word as they walked toward their old car parked under a flickering street lamp. The silence between them was deafening. Angela wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the words stuck in her throat. How could she promise something she wasn't sure of? What had happened inside that courtroom wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. It wasn't just about the stolen bike anymore. It was about how her son had been treated, like he was less than human. Her chest tightened with anger and helplessness. She couldn't let this go unanswered. Someone needed to stand up for Marcus, and if no one else would do it, then she would. That night, after putting Marcus to bed, Angela sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. Papers were spread out in front of her, copies of the police report, notes she'd scribbled during the trial, and a transcript of Judge Holloway's comments that she'd managed to get through a friend who worked in the courthouse. Her hands trembled slightly as she read through the transcript again. Each line felt like a fresh wound, reopening the hurt she'd seen on Marcus's face earlier that day. But beneath the pain, something else burned within her: determination. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number of a local civil rights activist named Ms. Evelyn Carter. Angela had attended one of Evelyn's community meetings months ago, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now she hoped Evelyn might have some advice, or better yet, connections. After a few rings, Evelyn answered, her voice warm but cautious. "Miss Carter," Angela began, trying to keep her tone steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I need your help. My son, he was humiliated in court today by Judge Holloway. I think it's part of a bigger problem, and I don't know where to start." Evelyn listened patiently as Angela recounted the details of the case: the mocking, the lack of evidence, the outright dismissal of Marcus's side of the story. By the end of the call, Evelyn sounded both sympathetic and intrigued. "This isn't the first complaint I've heard about Judge Holloway," she admitted. "If you're willing to speak out, we can try to shine a light on this. But it won't be easy. Are you ready for that?" Angela hesitated only for a moment before responding firmly. "Yes. For my son, I'm ready." Over the next few days, Angela threw herself into gathering information. She reached out to neighbors, teachers, and anyone else who might have witnessed similar behavior from Judge Holloway. One neighbor mentioned how her nephew had once received an unusually harsh sentence for a minor offense. Another shared a story about a friend whose child had been publicly ridiculed in court for being late to a hearing. The more Angela learned, the clearer it became that Marcus's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. But collecting stories wasn't enough. Angela knew they needed someone with a platform, someone who could amplify their voices and force people to pay attention. That's when she decided to contact Sarah Bennett, a young journalist known for covering social justice issues. Angela had seen Sarah's articles online and admired her ability to turn complex problems into compelling narratives. When Sarah arrived at Angela's modest home for an interview, she immediately noticed the care and effort Angela had put into organizing everything. The dining table was covered with neatly stacked documents, handwritten notes, and printed photos. Sarah listened intently as Angela spoke, her voice trembling with emotion, but also filled with resolve. "This isn't just about my son," Angela said, leaning forward. "It's about every child who walks into that courtroom and feels like they don't matter. We have to show them that they do matter, that their voices deserve to be heard." By the time Sarah left, she was convinced this was a story worth telling. Angela watched her go, feeling the mix of hope and fear. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, criticism, and moments when she'd doubt herself. But deep down, she believed that standing up for Marcus was the right thing to do, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small and powerless in the face of injustice. As the investigation into Judge Holloway intensified, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. The weight of everything, the protests, the media attention, the emotional toll of reliving that day in court, was overwhelming. Some days, he felt like he was carrying the hopes and frustrations of an entire community on his shoulders. But art had always been his escape, and now it became more than just a hobby. It became his voice. Encouraged by Evelyn and Sarah, Marcus began working on a new painting. This one would be different from the others. It wouldn't focus solely on pain or injustice. Instead, it would capture hope, resilience, and the possibility of change. He titled it Breaking the Chains. The canvas showed a young boy standing tall, breaking free from shackles made of shadowy figures meant to represent prejudice and bias. Behind him, sunlight streamed through cracks in a dark sky, symbolizing a brighter future ahead. When the painting was complete, Evelyn arranged for it to be displayed at a prestigious gallery in the city as part of an exhibition called Art Against Injustice. The event drew large crowds, including activists, artists, and even politicians eager to align themselves with the growing movement. As attendees moved through the gallery, many stopped in front of Marcus's piece, captivated by its bold colors and powerful imagery. Some snapped photos to share online, while others stood silently, visibly moved. One visitor who lingered longest was Claire Bennett, a renowned art curator known for championing underrepresented voices in the art world. She approached Marcus after the exhibition, her eyes shining with admiration. "Your work has a way of speaking directly to the soul," she said, extending her hand. "I'd love to feature your paintings in an upcoming national showcase. Would you be interested?" Marcus froze, unsure how to respond. He glanced at Angela, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Yeah," he stammered finally. "That would be amazing." For the first time in months, he felt a spark of excitement, not just about the opportunity, but about the idea that his art could reach even more people and inspire them to think differently. The recognition didn't stop there. A local news station featured Marcus in a segment highlighting young changemakers using creativity to drive social progress. During the interview, Marcus spoke softly but confidently, explaining how painting helped him channel his emotions and share his story. "It's not just about me," he said earnestly. "It's about everyone who feels like they don't have a voice. I want my art to remind them that they matter." Back at school, Marcus noticed a shift in how his classmates treated him. Before, some had teased him for being quiet or kept their distance because of the rumors swirling around his case. Now they approached him with curiosity and respect, asking questions about his paintings or congratulating him on the gallery show. Teachers praised his courage, inviting him to speak during class discussions about justice and equality. Slowly but surely, Marcus started to feel like he belonged again. Meanwhile, Angela continued to lead the charge against Judge Holloway, attending hearings and meetings organized by the Judicial Board. Her determination never wavered, even when faced with resistance from those who tried to downplay the severity of the situation. One evening, exhausted but resolute, she sat down with Marcus to talk about what might happen next. "No matter what comes out of this," she told him, her voice firm yet gentle, "we've already won in so many ways. We've shown people that they can stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it seems. And we've reminded them that art, words, and actions, all of it matters." Her words stayed with Marcus long after their conversation ended. They reminded him of why he had started painting in the first place, not just to heal himself, but to connect with others and make a difference. Art had given him a platform, a way to turn pain into purpose. And as he prepared for the national showcase, he realized something important. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was learning to dream again, imagining a world where fairness wasn't the exception but the rule. For Angela, seeing her son rediscover his confidence was a victory in itself. She knew the road ahead would still be challenging, especially as the Judicial Board deliberated over Judge Holloway's fate. But watching Marcus transform from a scared boy into someone capable of inspiring others filled her with pride. Together, they were proving that even in the face of adversity, hope could shine through. And sometimes, it came in the form of a brushstroke. The final verdict came on a crisp autumn morning, announced in a packed courtroom filled with anticipation. After weeks of deliberation, the State Judicial Board ruled unanimously to remove Judge Richard Holloway from the bench. The decision sent shockwaves through the legal community and beyond, marking one of the rare instances where a sitting judge faced such severe consequences for misconduct. As the gavel fell, sealing Holloway's fate, Marcus felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a quiet sadness that this chapter was finally closing. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted from a crowd gathered to hear the outcome. Strangers embraced, tears streaming down faces as people celebrated not just the removal of one man, but the possibility of a fairer system. Angela stood beside Marcus, her arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. She looked out at the sea of supporters who had rallied behind them, the activists, journalists, teachers, and ordinary citizens, and whispered softly, "We did it." Marcus nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe freely again. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Marcus returned to school with renewed confidence, no longer shrinking away from conversations or avoiding eye contact in the hallways. His classmates treated him differently now, not with pity, but with admiration. Teachers praised his resilience, often pointing to his story as an example of how courage could spark change. Even the principal invited him to speak at an assembly about using art and activism to make a difference. Standing in front of his peers, Marcus realized he had become someone others looked up to, a role model in ways he never imagined. Meanwhile, his artwork continued to gain recognition. Claire Bennett, the art curator who had discovered Marcus at the gallery exhibition, kept her promise and featured several of his pieces in a national showcase. One painting, titled "Breaking the Chains," became particularly iconic, symbolizing the fight against injustice and inspiring countless viewers. When reporters asked Marcus about its meaning, he spoke passionately about believing in yourself and standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. His words resonated deeply, especially among young people who saw themselves reflected in his journey. For Angela, seeing her son thrive brought immeasurable joy, but she also knew their work wasn't done. With Evelyn Carter's guidance, Angela joined forces with other advocates to push for broader reforms within the justice system. They lobbied for mandatory bias training for judges, greater transparency in court proceedings, and stronger protections for marginalized defendants. Though progress was slow, Angela remained steadfast, driven by the belief that real change required persistence. Years later, Marcus stood before a crowd once again. But this time, it wasn't as a victim or an activist. It was as a law student delivering a speech at his university's annual diversity symposium. Dressed in a suit tailored to fit his taller frame, he addressed the audience with poise and conviction. "When I was 14, I thought the world had written me off," he began, pausing to let his words sink in. "But I learned something important. Justice isn't handed to you, it's fought for. And sometimes, all it takes is one person saying, 'This isn't right.'" Behind him hung a slideshow of his paintings, each image telling a piece of his story. As he concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation honoring not just his achievements, but the resilience that had carried him through. Later that evening, as Marcus scrolled through congratulatory messages on his phone, he paused on a photo Evelyn had sent him, an old picture of him as a boy holding a paintbrush for the first time. Beneath it, she wrote simply, "Look how far you've come." Though Marcus's journey had been anything but easy, it had taught him invaluable lessons about strength, hope, and the power of collective action. He understood now that justice wasn't a destination, it was a process, one that required constant effort and unwavering belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. And while scars from the past would always remain, they served as reminders of how far he'd come and how much further he could go. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Marcus thought about the future, not just his own, but the futures of countless others inspired by his story. Somewhere out there, another child might be picking up a paintbrush or raising their voice, ready to challenge the injustices they saw around them. And in that moment, Marcus knew their fight had only just begun. Sarah's article hit the internet like a thunderclap. Titled "Injustice in the Courtroom: A Boy, a Judge, and a System That Failed," it was published on a Monday morning, just as people were starting their work week. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire across social media platforms, news outlets, and community forums. The headline alone drew people in, but it was the raw emotion and undeniable evidence within the piece that kept them reading and sharing. The article opened with Marcus's story, painting a vivid picture of the courtroom scene. Sarah described how Judge Holloway's mocking tone had cut through the room like a knife, leaving a 14-year-old boy humiliated and broken. She included quotes from Angela, capturing her pain and determination, as well as excerpts from the court transcripts that revealed the judge's cruel remarks. But what truly made the article resonate was its broader context. Sarah wove in testimonies from others who had faced similar treatment at Holloway's hands. People like James Carter, whose lives had been forever marked by the judge's bias. As the article gained traction, public reaction poured in. Some readers expressed outrage, flooding comment sections with messages of support for Marcus and calls for accountability. Others shared their own stories of discrimination in courtrooms, turning the conversation into a national dialogue about systemic injustice. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #HoldJudges began trending on Twitter, while Instagram users posted black and white photos of themselves holding signs that read, "No more mockery of justice." But not everyone agreed. Critics argued that judges should have discretion in maintaining order in their courtrooms, accusing Sarah and Angela of exaggerating the situation. A few even defended Judge Holloway, claiming he was simply doing his job. These opposing voices only fueled the debate further, drawing more attention to the issue and forcing people to take sides. Amid the chaos, Marcus struggled to keep up with daily life. The sudden spotlight made him feel exposed and vulnerable. He avoided school for a few days, unable to face curious stares or whispered conversations in the hallways. His grades suffered, and his teachers grew concerned. Angela noticed her son withdrawing into himself again, retreating to his room after dinner and spending hours staring out the window. She knew the pressure was getting to him, but she also saw glimpses of resilience in his eyes, a quiet determination to see this fight through. One evening, as Angela helped Marcus clean his art supplies scattered across the kitchen table, she suggested he try painting something to express how he felt. At first, Marcus hesitated. Art had always been a hobby for him, a way to pass the time. But now it seemed pointless. What good could a painting do against a powerful judge? Still, encouraged by his mother's gentle persistence, he picked up a brush and dipped it into a deep blue hue. Hours later, Marcus stepped back to examine his work. On the canvas was a striking image of a young boy standing before a towering judge's bench. The boy looked small and fragile, almost swallowed by the shadows cast by the imposing figure above him. Yet in the corner of the painting, a single beam of light shone down on the boy, illuminating his face with a look of quiet defiance. Angela stared at the painting, her breath catching in her throat. "This is powerful, Marcus," she said softly. "It tells your story." Inspired by his mother's reaction, Marcus decided to create more pieces. Each painting depicted a different aspect of his journey. The fear, the anger, the hope. Word of his artwork reached Evelyn Carter, who immediately recognized its potential impact. Art speaks louder than words sometimes, she told Angela during one of their meetings. If we can get Marcus's paintings seen by the right people, they could become symbols of this movement. Evelyn arranged for Marcus's paintings to be displayed at a local community center, hosting a town hall meeting about judicial reform. When attendees walked in, they were greeted by the sight of Marcus's vivid, emotional works hanging on the walls. Conversations paused as people stopped to study the images, many visibly moved by what they saw. One woman wiped tears from her eyes as she stood in front of the bench, the painting of the boy overshadowed by the judge. "This is exactly how it feels," she murmured to no one in particular. For Marcus, seeing strangers connect with his art was both overwhelming and empowering. For the first time since the trial, he felt like his voice mattered, not because someone told him so, but because he could see it in the way people responded to his work. It was a small victory, but it gave him strength to keep going. Behind the scenes, Sarah continued her investigation, uncovering even more troubling details about Judge Holloway's conduct. With each new revelation, the